The fall of Babylon the Great. We started to look at that last week's episode, and we're going to continue on this week's episode of the podcast as we are going to finish up our look at Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18, obviously part of the longer study that we're doing on the whole book of Revelation, and we are continuing to work our way through. We're getting closer and closer to the end of this book. A lot of good things in store ahead, even after chapter 18. But some insightful things to see as it relates to where we are right now in chapter 18. Specifically, again, in relation to what's going to be presented to us as far as the fall of Babylon the Great. Largely what we see is the reaction of everybody who went into her, so to speak. Babylon the Great, which was also personified as a harlot, a woman of promiscuity in chapter 17. And with the destruction of this prostitute, with the destruction of Babylon the Great, how this affects everybody else in the world and what their reaction is, their sorrowful and lamenting reaction to everything that's going on is pretty telling. How they react to certain things, but how there's a different response, and how there should be a different response from the Christian world. Now, keep in mind, all of this having to do with the destruction of Babylon the Great are things that happen immediately before the end. But it should give us some perspective even now, and who knows? With Jesus Christ can come back in our lifetime. We might be of that number. Who's called to have this different perspective and this rejoicing over the fall of Babylon the Great. What does all of that mean? How should we look at all of this? What does this say about people of the world who don't have Christ and who have engaged in harlotry with the prostitute? Some very insightful things, I think, that we can draw out of this passage. So we'll finish up chapter 18 on this episode. Good things in store. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, well, we're going to try and get into it as quickly as possible here, but let me just say this one thing. If there's anything that I think that, something that we could really draw from, there's a lot of things that you can draw from this text, but one of the things I think that really stands out to me is, the whole thing of, just the deceptiveness of worldly riches and wealth and that sort of thing. This isn't in any way, and I think I've mentioned this in times past before, this isn't to say that wealth and material things are in and of themselves bad, or having them are in and of itself bad. I think I've pointed out before that even men and women of the Bible, there's some who are wealthy, but they're godly. The name of the game here, with what we've been seeing for the past several weeks in chapter 17, and even with what we're looking at in chapter 18. What we're looking at here is the allure of the prostitute, whose goal is to draw people away from the one true God. Now, the people of the world, the people of the earth, the unbelievers, the draw is pretty easy. I think by and large. People of the church are not immune to that draw and that allure. Now, I don't think that they'll fall into judgment like the prostitute does, and we talked a little bit about that last time. But there is a certain element where there is that kind of astonishment and the lure, and maybe even in some instances a temptation of, clinging to those things and forgetting who you truly belong to. Okay. You can look at Laodicea as a case in point. They were a rich church within a rich community, within a rich city. And their attitude seemed to suggest that they didn't even need God. Now, I don't think that they would have said that out loud or explicitly or things like that, but it's the way that the mindset that is adopted once you kind of start to fall in love with the things that you have. And they say that I'm in need of nothing. And in that letter it says, little do you know that you're pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. That kind of shows, the dire straits that you are in spiritually. Now, if you remember, because this is something from way, way, way back. We're talking about in chapter 3. what we talked about as it related to the church in Laodicea. We're not dealing with a church that was a fake church that was that was made up of non-Christians. This was an actual church, but it lost its way in its perspective on how to look at these things. And Jesus himself even says, I rebuke those that I discipline. I discipline those that I love. So that's the sound of a loving God towards his church, who seems to have forgotten who their true source is. Okay. And there's rebuke, there's discipline, but there's not eternal condemnation as you would see with the harlot. And even with what you see with John, you see that John saw the harlot, he saw the prostitute, and he was amazed. And remember, and this is at the end of chapter 17, actually in the middle of chapter 17, I think, or actually near the beginning of chapter 17, he looks at the woman and is amazed, and the angel that's speaking to him says, "Why are you amazed by this? I'm going to show you what's up with all of this." Okay. And especially in a culture like ours, I mean, this is something that we really need to be careful of. And it's very tempting to think that when we think of rich, we think of millionaires and billionaires and that sort of thing. But I think on a relative level, where many Americans are in the United States today, financially, economically, and so forth, compared to what you have in the first century or even in other places in the world today, we are actually, comparatively speaking, very rich. You might not be a Warren Buffett, you might not be a Donald Trump, you might not be a Bill Gates or something like that, but in other places of the world, you might as well be. In the first century context, you might as well be. And so a lot of the things a lot of people might not be longing for the huge mansion, although a lot of people I'm sure do. But I mean, as far as the wants and the desires and the luxuries and just being drawn into that and thinking that that's where life is at. And if it means, having to put certain things of God aside in order to get those things, then so be it. Understand that to be in that position, you don't have to be one who's lusting and salivating over a huge mansion, like Wayne Manor or something like that. A lot of the things as far as what is considered rich, many of you are already there and you're not Bill Gates. Okay. So even the things that we look at in our society today, we might be in the same position as John was in chapter 17, and we look at the allure of that, not realizing that, hey, not everything is as it seems to be. Now, again, those things in and of themselves are not bad, but there's a game that's played, in this whole spiritual exercise of, if we're talking about Babylon the Great, the prostitute, the woman, and what her end game is. Her end game is not very good. And remember, we saw her as one who was riding the beast, and the beast is bad news. Remember what we said about John. John seemed to fixate his gaze on the woman, and it was almost as if he forgot about the beast on whom she rode. And so as part of this reminder of what all the things that was going on, the angel had to describe what's going on with the beast and how the beast is going to be going to destruction. So you see the whole thing there. But even before the beast is going to go to destruction, the beast and the 10 horns are going to turn on the woman and is going to destroy her. And what we're going to see in our passage today in Revelation chapter 18, there's a couple of things that you see here with the destruction of Babylon the Great, or the harlot. Again, I think you can use those two interchangeably. And that is that the destruction of Babylon the Great is both swift and total. Okay. And from the language of the passage that we're going to see today, which again is chapter 18, verses 9 through 24. So basically the rest of the chapter, you're going to see here, you're going to see how that plays out. And so, and again, we are to be ones who are separated from that sort of thing. And even to the point that one thing that we pointed out last time when we looked at the first 8 verses, when there was the call in verse 4 to come out of her, my people, again, I think that's a final reaching out, a final command for repentance for those people who would come to know the Lord Jesus Christ. And in doing so, they separate themselves from the plagues that the woman is going to suffer in her swift and total destruction. Not everybody's going to heed to that call, okay? Not everybody's going to heed to that call. And so when you see Babylon the Great fallen as she is, it has a pretty profound effect on everybody who engaged in business with her, okay? And so there was the announcement of the judgment in what we saw last time in verses 1 through 8. It's declared. We saw the haughty spirit of Babylon the Great, of the woman, and how she said she's a queen and she's never going to be a widow and so forth and so on. And, basically what we see is that she's going to be paid back for all the things that she's been engaged in, with all the things with having to do with her immorality, and in all of those things that she does with the nations and everything like that. So we see that what's coming up is not good for Babylon the Great. Now, with Babylon the Great, when she falls, how's everybody else going to look at this? Okay, and that's basically what we're going to see. And so we'd see, a few different categories here that explains, what goes down with these categories of people when they see the destruction of Babylon the Great. And the first category that we look at here, the first category that we see are the kings of the earth. Okay, so in chapter 18, verses 9 through 9 and 10. And it says, "And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, 'Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come.'" Okay, so a few things to point out here, and here's one thing that's somewhat interesting here, because as I said here, this first category of people that we're dealing with here are the kings of the earth, which we saw back in chapter 17, is that the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her. You see that back at the beginning of chapter 17. One of the things that you also see, though, if you go back again even later in chapter 17, let's see in verse 16, it says, "And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute," i.e. Babylon the Great, because remember that's how the prostitute was identified earlier in chapter 17. "They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire." Okay, so we'll just stop right there. Verse 17 goes into the sovereignty of God and how God put it in their hearts to do all of this. Okay, but if you remember from our discussion in chapter 17 regarding the 10 horns, we saw that the 10 horns were 10 kings. Now, 10 being a symbol in the book of Revelation of totality, and these 10 horns, as it's described even there in chapter 17, if you go back to verse 14, it says, "They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful." So these 10 horns are 10 kings, as chapter 17 described it earlier. And it says in verse 14 of chapter 17 that they make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, which is parallel to what you see with the gathering of the kings of the whole world for the Battle of Armageddon back in Revelation chapter 16. Remember that section that we saw in verses 12 through 16. And so the kings of the east, also known as the kings of the whole world, in that same passage of chapter 16, will gather to make war against God and against his people. And we see the 10 horns who are going to make war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. Okay, so I think that in a very real way, you can equate the 10 horns to the kings of the whole world that you saw in chapter 16. They're parallel to one another. So those 10 horns are the kings of the earth. okay, at the end times, who are going to make war with the saints. Now, what we just read a little bit later there about the 10 horns is that how they will, in verse 16, again, it says, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. For what reason, what's behind all of that, we don't know. But they will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. So it seems like the kings of the earth, are ones, or, as it says, they hate the prostitute, they turn against her, along with the beast turns against her, and they devour her and they destroy her. Now, in chapter 18, we see this category, the kings of the earth, who committed, and we're reminded there, these are the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, with the prostitute. Now look at what happens. Before in chapter 17, they hated the prostitute. Now in chapter 18, verse 9, it says they will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. Curious. That's very curious. So it's evident that you see somewhat of a shift there. Now, what can explain that? Excuse me. What can explain that shift? I couldn't tell you specifically. I think maybe to a certain degree, I wonder if what you're dealing with there is, there is some level of regret. Maybe in a certain sense, there's some, they feel the pangs of unintended consequences of their actions, not to mention the swiftness of the judgment and how quickly it affects they themselves. Some people, when it comes to certain actions, when it comes to certain evil actions or certain destructions and things like that, sometimes what's not brought into the mind is how this will affect them or people that they know, people that they care about, and that sort of thing. And so there's unintended consequences. And so once you enact something and then you start to feel the effects of it, you suddenly start to regret it and say, maybe this isn't something that I should have done. Remember, because these were kings of the earth who went in and committed sexual immorality with her. They were drawn in to the allure of the prostitute, of the beast. So there was something there. There was some affection there. Now, again, when they hated the prostitute, what brought that hatred about? I don't know. What was the root of that? I don't know. But whatever the case is, they, along with the beast, turn on her. And then when they see the swiftness of everything, you get a sense that not only because of the swiftness of the judgment, but how swiftly they feel the effects of it. Now you're dealing with the kings of the earth who are like, oh no. And so what you see here in verse 9 of chapter 18, it says they will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. Now the whole thing of smoke of her burning, remember that's playing off of what we saw in the previous verse, where it says, for this reason, her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. Okay. So there you see the whole thing of her being burned up, which, again, if you again are reminded of what we saw back in the Isaiah passage, we saw how this was even applied historically to the historical ancient Babylon, who made boasts just like Babylon the Great here does in the book of Revelation. Also in verse 8, while we're there, remember it says for this reason her plagues will come in a single day. There's the swiftness that I was talking about before. Remember at the beginning of this episode, I said we're going to see the swift and complete destruction of Babylon the Great, or at least how it's described. And so this is the sense that the kings of the earth get, and this is another one of the things that shakes them up so much. When they, again, as it says there in verse 9, when they see the smoke of her burning. You go into verse 10, it says, they will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon. Now watch, for in a single hour your judgment has come. In a single hour. So whether you're talking about single day in verse 8, single hour in verse 9, both of those expressions are supposed to give us this idea of quick and swiftness in the judgment that happens. It happens suddenly and quickly, okay? And it catches so many people off guard. The kings of the earth, the merchants, the seafarers, and those sorts of people, okay? So in a single hour, they see all this. Now, what's interesting to me, at least how it's laid out in my ESV, the lament that's laid out there in verse 10, where it says, "Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon." Now, this is said of the kings of the earth when they see the smoke of her burning and the swiftness with which it came, and yet they still call Babylon a mighty city. Seems to me they don't appear as mighty as they thought they were, right? But yet it's still locked in their minds that Babylon is a mighty city. So even as it's burning in its ashes, I mean, just metaphorically and just in a picture form, because again, Babylon the Great is not a literal city, just as the woman, the harlot, is. We're not talking about a literal human being, but but that represents everything in the anti-God, anti-Christian economic sort of play here, that we've been talking about before in chapter 17, and even what we've been talking about in the first part of chapter 18. Okay, so the harlot or Babylon the Great involves many, many things, many, many people, many, many nations, many, many factors. Okay, but I mean, they look and they say that this is, you mighty city Babylon, but this is as they're crying out and as they're in fear, as they said, in fear of her torment. Okay, so this is something that shakes them up. What's interesting is, and I think, the text isn't black and white on this, but I mean, it seems like with all the time that they're doing weeping over Babylon the Great, there isn't any sort of repenting going on as it relates to all of this. So that's kind of interesting. So that's the kings of the earth, okay, and that's their lament. Now we get to the second category here, where it says in verse 11, it says, "And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her." So same sort of thing, weeping and wailing for the kings of the earth, weeping and mourning for the merchants, the merchants who are in the state of business here. That's what they do. And they weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Now, in verses 12 through 13, you get a whole list of the things that that they sell, or that they had been selling before, but not so much anymore. Verse 12, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. These aren't second-rate products, by the way. And I think you get the sense of that as you're reading this. Articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, and sheep, horses, and chariots, and to top it all off, as it relates to the evil and everything that you see here, and slaves. That is human souls. Okay, so even in a slave trade, people are willing to do those things in order to get rich from Babylon the Great, rich from the prostitute. Okay, so but again, as you see there, the list of all the things that are laid out there, it shows you just kind of what kind of business that they were in. They were in the business of selling a lot of high value and costly things. No wonder they liked the woman, because they bought a lot of the expensive things from them. Now, this whole thing of listing out all the things that they engaged in commerce for, and just the things that they sold and everything like that is reminiscent of what you see in Ezekiel chapter 27 as it relates to Tyre and the destruction of Tyre. And we don't have to read the passage. I'll just give you the reference, just for your own information. You can look at it later. But in Ezekiel chapter 27, verses 12 through 25, you kind of see the same, kind of similar thing going on there. Again, this is in the context of announcing the destruction of Tyre. And in that passage, it lists, all these other nations who were engaged in commerce with Tyre and what what products that they engaged in business with and what was sold and everything like that. So, there's a draw, from the Old Testament once again, that when it relates to Revelation, the first century audience who's hearing this read to them would immediately find the similarity in the familiar language, that's drawn from the Old Testament. So that's what you're dealing with. That's what you're dealing with here. Basically, what you have here is a massive business reduction. I mean, if you want to talk about a recession, I mean, this is probably, maybe you can say this is the recession of all recessions, maybe. I mean, I don't know, maybe, is that embellished language? I don't know. But that's the sense that you get when you read through this, and even with what the merchants, what they were used to selling, but now they can't anymore. Because it says there in verse 11, no one buys their cargo anymore. Now, if you're in any kind of business, no matter what product or service you're engaged in, what product or service you're selling, if nobody's buying your material or taking advantage of your services, you're going to be in big trouble. And many a business today, regardless of, any sort of spiritual standing or anything like that, we're just talking about the regular workings of life and business, the business cycle. There are many people who are in business, who have started up businesses, and they're in big trouble because they can't sell their product or they've hit upon hard times, that sort of thing. And it's a hardship. It is a hardship. And so that's the sense that you're supposed to get when it relates to the merchants. Now, even though the merchants are in view here, notice in verse 14 are words that are spoken to, I believe, Babylon the Great. The words from the merchants are going to be seen in verses 16 and 17. But before we get to those words there, verse 14, listen to these words here. It says, the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. Notice the permanency there. And there's where you get a sense of the completeness of this destruction. So remember, swiftness, completeness of this destruction here, because it says there, never to be found again. All right. So this is a whole thing where this is it. Okay. This is the total destruction. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you. So if Babylon the Great, if this woman has lost everything, all that she had and all that she can use, the sense that you would get is that this is total desolation of the woman. So there is not even anything that she can do, that she can that she can spend to rebuild what she had before. It's all gone. So if the merchants of the earth are dependent on Babylon the Great in order to be successful in business, and now Babylon the Great is down for the count, and everything that she has is gone, never to be found again, that has a huge effect on the merchants, because again, Babylon the Great is the one who bought these things from them. Okay, and so that's pretty much what you're dealing with there, I believe. Now, I want to point out something that's kind of, to me, kind of interesting, because again, we're talking about the destruction of Babylon the Great, who is personified as a prostitute, a harlot, or whatever, who was riding the beast. So we saw that her connection before she was destroyed by the beast, by the way, but again, who had her association with the beast, someone who, as it said in chapter 17, was drunk on the blood of the saints. So we know that she is definitely anti-Christian, anti-God, right? And, with her association with the beast, and just thinking about things that we saw as it related to the beast back in chapter 13, and how the beast oppressed the saints and made war with the saints and conquered them, and the whole thing with the mark of the beast. And those people who refused to take the mark of the beast weren't allowed to buy or sell. Now, we don't need to go into an exhaustive review or explanation of what that means. It's not what many people interpret it to mean, but we don't need to go into that because that's not the really the scope of what we're wanting to talk about here. But keep in mind the whole thing of for those people who don't get the mark of the beast, they won't be able to buy or to sell. Now, with the destruction of Babylon the Great, okay, you have, with her destruction, everything is totally gone. So there's an inability for her to buy. And so with that, also with the destruction of Babylon the Great, how that affects the merchants of the earth. And because of this, the merchants aren't able to sell. So basically, I think what we're seeing here is a turning of the tables. Okay, where and again, from the first century context of not being able to buy or sell, we talked about how that looked in the first century world, especially as it related to the trade guilds who were associated with patron deities. And the Christians who were part of these trade guilds, they didn't want to be associated with the patron deity, but they needed to if they wanted to get the benefits from their trade. And if they refused, then they were out of that trade. And what would happen? They wouldn't be able to buy or sell. That's what you had there. So with this reversal now, and with God showing up on the scene, and God in his sovereign purposes working through the kings of the earth and the beast to destroy this prostitute. Now we see this reversal where the Babylon the Great and the merchants and everything, what do we see? An inability to be able to buy or sell. Okay. And again, I think that in a certain sense, that goes back to what we saw even before, where, in chapter 18, we're looking at verse 6, it says, pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds, mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. You see the whole thing there. So now there's that reversal that you see going on there. I think that's a pretty interesting observation there. So going further into verse 15, it says, the merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off. Notice there again is that distance. We saw that from the kings of the earth. The kings of the earth were ones who stood at a distance. And so we see the same thing here with the merchants. They will stand far off in fear of her torment. Okay, again, just like the kings of the earth. Weeping and mourning aloud. Now here's what they say in verse 16. It says, alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. And notice all this is past tense. That was clothed in fine. I mean, past tense, obviously, because now they're looking at Babylon the Great. Babylon the Great is up in smoke. Okay. Babylon the Great looked decked out. She looked amazing. So amazing that even it captivated John's attention. Okay. But now what do we see here? It's almost as if this is their own, I mean, they're weeping and wailing. It's almost like it's a memorial service. If you've ever been to a memorial service or a funeral or something like that, obviously, you talk about the deceased. You have some people who eulogize the person that they're remembering. And they say, we remember how they were like this, they were a kind person, they did this and that sort of thing. It's kind of like, you kind of have this remembrance, remember, when she was like this or what she possessed here, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. That's no more. That's gone. And, again, as it said there at the end of verse 14, never to be found again. Okay. Now in verse 17, it says here again, you get a sense of the swiftness of this. For in a single hour, all this wealth has been laid waste. So they recognize the swiftness of everything that's happened. This is all just collapsed just suddenly. And it's taken them for a loop. And so now they've got all these wares that they've been used to selling, or throughout their whole time that they've been doing business. Now they can't anymore. And so now they're there eulogizing the woman, Babylon the Great, remembering how she was decked out, but then also seeing in a single hour, all her wealth has been laid waste. And in the middle, the second part of verse 17 and into verse 18, we get into the third category of people. And it says, and all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, stood far off, verse 18, and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. So everybody's seeing the same thing. All right. And everybody, by the way, again, because it says here that they stood far off. Nobody's approaching Babylon the Great. Nobody's approaching this woman and saying, hey, are you okay? Do you need any help? Can I lift you up? They see what happened and they're standing far off because they're like, ooh, this is serious business here. It evoked fear in these people, as it said in a couple of those other categories. They look at this and they are scared out of their minds, and they should be. They should be. Right? So as you have it here, again, now what we're dealing with here are the shipmasters and the seafaring men, sailors, pretty much people whose business was out on the sea. Now, I think I mentioned before how, even with that, if you had seafaring business, that got you in connection with many other nations and things like that, kind of like ancient Babylon did, you're in pretty good shape. Right. And you can really get wealthy, if you're able to secure that sort of transportation and you're able to do that and have business connection with other nations and that sort of thing. But they're kind of in dire straits, too. And they stand far off, just like everybody else does. Verse 19, it says, and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? Right. The implied answer to that is that, there's nothing could compare to Babylon the Great. If there could be, then there would be another Babylon the Great that can just take her place. And I think that's what really grips these people. Because, if there's a replacement in the wings, then you're sad for the fall of this Babylon the Great. But it's not necessarily an economic tragedy because you have something else waiting in the wings. And if there's anything else waiting in the wings, it does not doesn't even come close to comparing to what you had with Babylon the Great. So you might as well just say that you've lost everything. And that's pretty much where we are right now in this passage. So again, there's a remembrance sort of thing where they say, who was like this, the great city? Who was like this great city? The implied answer was no one or nothing. Okay. But this again, in an indirect way, kind of shows you the greatness of God comparing to all these other things. This whole thing of where it says what city was like the great city, is kind of, it kind of sounds similar to the whole thing of who was like the beast, that we saw in chapter 13. And we're going to see how God and Jesus Christ is greater than the beast when we see his full and utter destruction later on in chapter 19 in the next chapter. But the language is kind of similar, and I think that's important for us to kind of at the very least observe that. Just as they utter that, as it says there, what city was like the great city? So they're looking at that and is saying, we're not going to have that again. So again, that suggests the whole thing of never to be found again. The swiftness and the completion of everything. Verse 19, it says, and they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. So again, this is the whole thing is that we've lost our greatest, or probably maybe our greatest and only source of gaining riches. Without her, we're done for as well. Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. Okay, for in a single hour she has been, so there again, they recognize the swiftness. For in a single hour, she has been laid waste. Okay. Now, what's interesting in verse 20, Verse 20 is, you see different words here addressed to a different group of people. Who's it addressed to? Saints, apostles, and prophets, God's people. Now notice what it says here. It says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Okay. Now, for some people, that might seem a little bit odd, because, you might think, when you see something like this, is this something that we're really supposed to rejoice over? Remember, what we're dealing with here in Babylon the Great or the harlot, we're not dealing with a literal person, so that we're rejoicing over the death of a person. You had to remember that this is a broad economic system that is rooted in things that are supposed to go against God and the things of God. That's worldwide, and draws people in away from the one true God, the dwellers of the earth, to shield them from coming to know the one true God, and even what allures the church to have them abandon the one true God. Okay. And so, and again, remember, connected to that allure is the whole thing of the death of the death of the saints. Remember that the prostitute was drunk on the blood of the saints, the witnesses of Jesus Christ. So this is a woman who was not friendly to the people of God by any means. Okay. And that's something that we have to remember, and that we have to understand. And so this whole thing of this rejoicing, they're called to rejoice, because they're right now here, we're starting to see vindication of God's people. It's interesting. It says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets. I believe it's in chapter 11 when you're looking at the second vision of the end. You see these categories of people, and except I think instead of saints, you have servants or slaves or bondservants. Apostles and prophets. I believe, let me just double check here real quick. I just have to flip back a few pages here. In chapter 11, where it says in verse 18, the nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints. Okay. So I guess it's the apostles that's missing in chapter 11 there. The prophets and saints are there in chapter 11 and as well here, which maybe that language again is supposed to tie us back to what we saw in chapter 11 in that vision of the end. Remember, I said I labeled it the second vision of the end. So we've already seen 4 visions of the end in the book of Revelation. That was the second one. Okay, and so. So these, the saints and the apostles and the prophets, are called to rejoice over the woman, and for the reason that for God has given judgment for you against her. Kind of sounds a little bit like Revelation chapter 6 and the souls of the martyrs underneath the altar, essentially asking how long before our blood is avenged, before we're vindicated. Now we're starting to see that vindication take place because this is the judgment for you against her. All right. This is all in connection to, the trouble that Babylon the Great has given to the saints. You get the same sense of that in verse 24, and also in the next chapter, what we're going to look at in chapter 19, verse 2. Okay. So this is the reason for the rejoicing there is because now what you see here is the vindication of God's saints. Okay, so in verse 21, let's see here. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence and will be found no more." Okay, so in case you didn't pick up before, in case you didn't get it in the previous verses, we're reminded again, they're going to be found no more. Again, this is going to be a complete destruction of this whole system here. Now, these words in verse, actually the description here in verse 21 and what you see here in verse 22, verses 21 and 22, gets its roots from the Old Testament as well in Jeremiah chapter 51, as it relates to talking about the destruction of the actual historical ancient Babylon. In chapter 15, when the calamities of Babylon are written down, in chapter 51 of Jeremiah, in verses 63 and 64, it says, "When you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates, and say, 'Thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted.'" Okay, so there you see even there the completeness of the whole thing of ancient Babylon, and that permanency of that destruction has lasted even up to today, right? So when it comes to Babylon the Great at the end, we see the same thing here. That's the picture that's supposed to be drawn in the reader's mind, or the hearers of the first century's mind. They would have recognized the similarity of description there from Jeremiah 51. And it gives them even a stronger sense of the permanency of this whole thing. So so with the millstone, a mighty angel throws into the sea, so will Babylon the Great be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. Verse 22. "And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more." Now, if you look at places like Isaiah chapter 24, I believe it's verse 8, and then in Ezekiel, I believe it's chapter 26, you see this kind of language as far as the ceasing of music being a sign of judgment having befallen a particular nation or a particular group of nations. So again, it's a drawing to the hearers, the audience's attention, of what's going on here. Basically, what you see in this section here, all the way to the end of the chapter, is a ceasing of everything having to do with regular, normal, everyday life. Even as it relates to the entertaining things like music. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. I mean, even if you think about music today, a lot of us like music, different instrumentations of music, different singers and that sort of thing. Imagine a world with no music. This is, this whole thing is going to be so devastating and it's no wonder, it's, without any sort of business or anything like that, there's really isn't any reason for those things to be picked up again. So it says the sound of harpists and musicians, all those things will be no more. And notice also it says right after that, "And a craftsman of any craft," not just particular crafts with this or that, but these ones are okay. It's like, "And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more." So notice, you're what we're starting to see. We saw in a general sense, the whole thing of the destruction of Babylon. It says, and will be found no more. Now we're seeing these particular subcategories and the repetition of, as far as music, will be heard no more. As far as the craftsman, you will be heard no more. And again, it says a craftsman of any craft. I mean, if you equate craft as people would understand it in the first century to maybe any sort of business industry anywhere in the world today, or that sort of thing, you think about in a big economic downturn, like perhaps like you would have seen in 2008 or something like that. The whole thing of, should we bail out the automobile industry? That sort of thing. At least the government was thinking that. Certain industries were hit harder than others. Not everybody was, quote unquote, eligible for a government bailout. And even with there, people were arguing whether the industry should be bailed out or whether you should let the economy just run its course. But here's the thing. The difference between what you saw in an example like that and what we're seeing here in Revelation chapter 18, again, any craft, all right? Which I think reasonably you can say that equates to any industry, as it relates to, business or entrepreneurship or whatever the case may be, that will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. So agriculture, food production, that sort of thing will be heard in the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. Okay, the whole thing of the sound of the mill not being heard anymore might be connected to what we just saw there in verse 21 with the millstone being thrown. The millstone is the stone that that was where you attached an ox to it, and the ox would walk around. And between these two millstones, it would crush the grain. Crush the grain there. So that's what you're dealing with there. In case you didn't know what that was, but I mean, even with that will be the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. Verse 23, and the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. Now, the whole thing in verse 23, oh gosh, that also is drawn from the Old Testament. I'm failing to remember where it is, though. Shame on me for that. Shame on me for that. I'll if I remember, I'll try to remember and bring that reference for you next time. But again, there you see another reference from the Old Testament that should be recognizable to the first century audience, that gives them this added emphasis on the fact that this is going to be a total destruction, just as it was back in Old Testament times of ancient Babylon and so forth and so on. So, but again, you see the regular things of life, and the light of the lamp will shine in you no more. There's going to be darkness now. And listen, and the voice of bridegroom and bride, we're talking about weddings and marriage and that sort of thing. Very joyous events, as it says there in verse 23, will be heard in you no more. Why? Still middle of verse 23, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. Interesting analogy there of the whole thing of sorcery. The allure was so great, it was almost as if it was a sorcerous sort of thing. Now it's not saying that it was a literal sorcery that was going on, but it's an analogous sort of term. It's almost as she was so compelling that it was almost as if she was able to cast a spell on them and bring them in, and so that's what you have there. And then in verse 24 it says, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints, and of the saints. There you go. And that's no different from what we saw before in chapter 17. She was drunk on the blood of the saints. So she has to answer for what she's done to God's people. God will bring retribution against her because of what has happened to the saints. And not only that, but it's also in verse 24, it says, right there at the very end, it says, and of all who have been slain on earth. Now, who are those? Is that another category of Christians? Who knows? It could be people who aren't necessarily of the church, but those people who perhaps stood in the way of the harlot and paid the price for it. Doesn't mean that they were pro-God or pro-Christian. That I think would tend to tell you a little bit more, just how evil and wicked the harlot is, and that's not hard to understand. If we're dealing with people, even though they're not Christians, how someone like the harlot would kill other people of the earth. You see people turning against one another, even though both parties are anti-God. We just saw it in chapter 17. The beast and the 10 horns turn against the prostitute, right? So why can't we see the same thing here? And even though these other people who are slain to the earth may not be Christians, it doesn't mean that bloodshed, whatever that would be, is right. It's not, because it's still a killing of people who are made in the image of God. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean they're not saved necessarily. If we're talking about a different category other than Christians. But when you're focusing on the harlot herself, Babylon the Great herself, and what you see the lengths that she goes to in order to carry out all the wickedness that she has as it relates to her dealings with the nations. Okay. And she's paid the price for it. Now, just as we kind of start to draw this to a close, I want to remind you here. I think I mentioned it in this way a little, earlier before. That what you're dealing with here, I mean, the church has to beware of the lure of the prostitute as well. Even though I don't believe that the church would be one who would be destroyed along with the prostitute, and I explained why earlier in this episode. But we still need to be careful. Now, the one thing that might have gone through your minds is that, well, if the prostitute is drunk on the blood of the saints, shouldn't that be a tip off that, doesn't that serve as a turn off for the church? As far as her view or attitude towards Babylon the Great, because of her hatred for God and for the saints and everything. Not necessarily. You would think that it might. And again, this is the deviousness of everything that goes on here, and we have to be very careful. And the one thing that I want to do is point out to you a first century example in the book of James, chapter 2, of what something like this might look like. And this has to do with the Christians that James is writing to, their differing attitude as it relates to the rich versus the poor. The rich they held in high esteem and treated very well, and the poor they treated kind of trashy. In James chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, where it says, "My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' while you say to the poor man, 'You stand over there,' or 'Sit down at my feet,' have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" You see where there's that drawing there towards the people who are rich and giving them better treatment, as opposed to the poor, where they just kind of, it's like, yeah, you just kind of sit over there, or sit down at my feet in a kind of subjugated position, that sort of thing. Let's see. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Verse 5, "Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom?" Now, that's not to say that anybody who's rich can't become an heir to the kingdom. The offer of the gospel is theirs just as it is to the poor. But I believe Jesus has also said it's very difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, right? So it's not it's you see the distinction there, though. And so for a lot of people who are rich, the kingdom wasn't theirs because they were willing to hang on to their riches and everything like that, and not embrace Christ and let go of everything that they had as their idols. That's a whole nother subject and topic to talk about. But all that to say that it doesn't mean that there are no rich people that can enter the kingdom of heaven. It's very difficult. And it's not to say that every poor person inherits the kingdom, because a poor person can reject Christ just like the rich for many different reasons as well. Just want to lay that out and establish that. Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? Now, verse 6, "But you have dishonored the poor." Now listen, "Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called?" That's interesting. That description in verses 6 and 7, as it relates to the treatment of the rich towards the saints and how they blaspheme God, and yet the people that James was writing to was chastising them for giving them, just by the basis of their riches alone, preferential treatment over the poor. That seems to show that the allure, that's a kind of a micro picture of, I think, of Babylon the Great and the allure that it can have on people in the church, okay? So is it impossible, even with how, the rich system or whatever like that can treat saints, brothers and sisters in Christ, wouldn't it be impossible for Christians to be allured by that? No. You see a micro version of that in James chapter 2. So let that be a warning to you, and understand that we need to be very, very careful as it relates to that. Our source is only one person, and that's Jesus Christ. We shouldn't be allured by the prostitute, because the prostitute, as we see in chapter 17 and 18, is going down for the count, never to be found again. Again, in case you didn't get that before, you repeat that over and over and over again. But this is the judgment on our behalf, as it said there in the middle of the passage that we looked at there. So if we understand what the woman is all about, we understand that she's going to destruction, and if we understand what our future is, that should change our perspective. And that's where we get into chapter 19. It's very interesting. When we get into chapter 19, we start talking about bride and bridegroom, the bride of Christ and that sort of thing, certain varying descriptions of that in chapter 19 as it describes God's people. Whereas in Babylon the Great, it's interesting because we just got done seeing there, and the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard no more, will be heard in you no more. That's in an earthly sense as it relates to people of the world, Babylon the Great and everything like that. But for us, there is the ultimate marriage that will happen. It will be heard about, and it will be glorious. And we'll start to get into that once we get into chapter 19, which we will begin next time. Okay? So let all of that sink in. I hope the lessons in there are profitable. Meditate on this. Read the passage over again. Dive deeper into Scripture. I hope that for a lot of you, as it relates to our times here in studying Scripture, that this isn't the end point. I hope that in many ways, and especially with a book like Revelation, I hope that this is a beginning point for you to dig deeper into Scripture. Okay. And I would encourage you to do that and let the Holy Spirit guide where he leads. Okay. So we'll leave it there for now. If you enjoy the show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And one other thing, I can't believe, I think I forgot the shameless plug. I don't remember and here's how sad things are. I don't remember if I did the shameless plug or not. I don't think I did. That's kind of sad that I can't remember if I did that or not. Usually it will be like, oh, I forgot to do that, but I'm not even sure if I forgot or not or what. Okay. Anyway, shameless plug. For my book, Signs of the End, What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. As usual, I will leave a link in the episode description so you can click to the link on the Amazon page and order my book from there. All right, well, I enjoyed my time in the Word and exploring Scripture with you as I always do. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.